So when you think of esports journalism, you think of maybe objectivism or someone that is supposed to give you the full entire story. But I don't actually see that within esports journalism. In fact, I see that it is partially controlled by public opinion as well as access, and the fact that people trying to get a paycheck necessarily. So when you look at the entire way of how at least League of Legends esports journalism works, is the fact that they rely on Riot Games access for post-match interviews, and the fact that, well, if you aren't in the good graces of Riot Games, then you don't get access to post-match interviews. Hence, with the situation that happened with Loco Doco, to where he was barred from post-match interviews because of something that he said within I guess a Riot meeting, or something along those lines, where he said something sexual as a joke, in fact, which can only be determined as a joke, as was revealed by Jacob Wolf, Thorne, and Richard Lewis. And he got ostracized completely from, post-match interviews, which then kind of had to take his content creation direction into a different avenue. And so you begin to wonder exactly who, I guess, pays for these guys' paychecks, and how much out of line can they speak out of pocket when it comes to being a esports journalist or a part of the press corps, etc. And so this was brought on, I think, further exacerbated by Travis Gafford, and how he had spoken out and said that, it's not cool that Riot Games are screening our questions. This was in 2020, I think. Riot Games were screening our questions and asking the players directly, etc. And that's really fucked up. And now you could see the entire hypocrisy within what he had stated in terms of that, and then how necessarily Loco Doco was ostracized from that. And it obviously alludes to what Richard Lewis and Jacob Wolf and Thorne were talking about, how there was some beef between Travis Gafford and Loco Doco itself. But we're not going to get into that necessarily. But in the fact that, yes, the idea that Riot was trying to control the press is another tactic in which you could see that there is an overbearing presence, I guess, between the press and Riot Games. Now, I'm not going to say the roast of Travis Gafford from the Four Horsemen was unnecessary or unjustified. I think that it was, but also too, you have to consider that maybe they had left out a portion, considering that I think Travis Gafford has helped out the entire esports journalism community, as far as, at least Riot, journalists or people that cover League of Legends is concerned, because I actually attribute a lot of my growth or a lot of my teachings, or maybe people that I've analyzed, a lot towards Travis Gafford. I think that he is maybe one of the people, if you're a beginner, that you want to study initially, because he gives a very good base understanding of how to actually do questions and do interviews, etc. So I always thank Travis Gafford for just covering the baseline of that as such. But with that said, I do think that he's incredibly biased in some particular aspects. Like, I was going back in history, and I was looking at this GameSpot interview that he did with Reginald, talking about Chris Badawi, and how Chris Badawi had poached tried to poach some of TSM's players, right, of Bjergsen and Parth, etc. And this was back in I want to say 2015. And so you could see that Travis is somewhat of a puppet in that aspect, and maybe he doesn't realize that. He doesn't realize that he's being pulled in terms of how he can shape the entire audience or the entire narrative. And that's what I have a problem with him specifically, in the fact that I think that he is naive in the sense of how much actual power that he has in terms of the entire narrative that can be discussed within the LCS. I actually don't think he knows how much power that he has within that. And the fact that he is somewhat of a quasi unbiased party. Although when I looked back at some of those Reddit threads back in 2015 about this particular topic, people were even then talking about how biased Travis was and how he was a shill for Riot Games and etc. And I was just like, yo, I thought this was a common narrative, like in this current day and age, but I guess it extends back to that. And so like this precedes like this entire idea of that this is like a recency bias type of thing. It has actually always existed, which is kind of funny. But what I find disappointing is that there is a lack of opinion within this entire space, and the fact that it's, you know, like Travis Gafford, yeah, he does produce a lack of opinion. He doesn't produce a lot of opinion pieces, whether written or video, in fact. And I think that's the entire disappointing thing about Travis Gafford, is the fact that he goes along with certain narratives and he doesn't challenge those narratives. Even within his interviews, he doesn't challenge certain narratives, etc. And I find that very disturbing in that aspect. The same thing goes with Ashley Kang. I find that she goes along with a lot of particular narratives, and the fact that she doesn't question said narratives, or she doesn't provide particular opinion pieces to challenge such narratives. And I think this is very important because there is a lack of presence when it comes to video from the press. I mean, when I think of the press in terms of video, I can only think of Travis Gafford, Ashley Kang, you know, as far as like Western audience, Travis Gafford, Ashley Kang, and then me. Like that's, and like this might be my bias. I might just not be looking around enough in order to know this, but I find that there is a big lack of this. And so with that said, if they don't challenge the entire narrative, then that becomes the entire consensus. And so you see this types of things with what I would consider one of the big controlling hubs of what is the narrative, which is Reddit. Like, I think no one can deny that Reddit has a large control of the narrative. And I had already gone into the topic of how, you know, Reddit is like this toxic culture in terms of controlling said narrative, etc. But that becomes maybe quite problematic in the sense that if you let that control the entire narrative, then it just necessarily runs rampant in that, I guess, ideology, right? And so you never get a different perspective of that. And so with all of this said, with, you know, all of these narratives and how everyone makes money and etc., and how with being controlled by that narrative and the fact that you're incentivized to actually go further and further into that narrative to get upvotes within Reddit, etc., which is probably why a lot of these journalists, or why a lot of these press ended up doing the stories that they do, is so that they can get upvotes on Reddit. So they just contribute to the solidified narrative of what is already solidified, right? So that you don't necessarily get downvoted for a dissenting opinion. Like, this becomes a cyclical pattern. And with that said, I think it's because they try and make money from esports journalism, because that is what is incentivized from that. So like for me, I make a negligible amount of money from esports writing, right? Like my writing, actually oftentimes I don't even make money from my writing, especially if I do a illustrative piece. So like me, Volumil, and I think Thorn are like one of the three big people that I think do illustrative pieces that don't make money. Volumil, he did the Many-Faced God of Twilight, which he had a piece commission. And I'm pretty sure that he didn't make any fucking money off of that, because in order to get a art piece commissioned, it takes money in order to get that artwork produced. And writing a piece, you don't really get a whole lot of money from. So like even me with that Riot Light piece, I actually made negative amount of money. I lost money just to do that article, not to mention the time investment of like 3 weeks of research. I lost untold amounts of money of doing that, because I could have been doing something else that fucking made me money. And not only that, but I paid an artist to do that illustration. Same thing with Thorn. Well, Thorn actually probably makes money from his articles, even if he does a illustration piece, because, you know, he is a legendary writer, right? But like still, it's the fact that I'm willing to make a like no amount of money or negative amount of money to put my shit out there. And I think not a lot of other people are willing to do that. Now, I think what people have pushed the envelope in terms of making acceptable writing is like, Jacob Wolf obviously pushed the envelope in terms of doing like free agency or leaks, etc. I think that's really good, and I think that's really good for journalism and esports, etc. But then you have people like Richard Lewis, which are disappearing now in terms of investigative reporting. You have Thorne, which I think is disappearing too in terms of opinion pieces. And so it's like, who is really paying these journalists in terms of their writings, etc.? I think this is going to slowly exacerbate in terms of just how esports journalism operates or esports writing operates, and I find that very disappointing. And I think that this is entirely a dying industry, but I find also too that the people that are at the very top of the industry itself aren't actually challenging certain things that they should be. And so that's what I find actually massively disappointing, in the fact that maybe some of these people are actually writing for a paycheck more than actually trying to progress this industry in and of itself.